Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director here at GNAT. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. It's also a pleasure to have with us here in the studio Lawrence Zupan, who is a Manchester area real estate broker, who's one of 4 candidates who are vying for the Republican nomination for the U.S. Senate. Lawrence has been living in the area since 1986. He's worked in a variety of different businesses along the way. Also, for a time, hosted a show here at GNAT. So, welcome back to the studio, Lawrence.
Thank you, Andrew. It's good to be with you.
Great to have you with us today. Like I said, you're one of 4 Republicans who are vying for the nomination to challenge Bernie Sanders, a likely Democratic nominee. This is your first try for political office,
Yes.
Local or statewide, and must be quite a daunting venture. But just to get us started, tell us a little bit about your background and kind of what prompted the idea to run for the U.S. Senate.
Well, I'm fond of a little story that answers that question, I think. Bill and Ed were out hunting for the first time in the Green Mountains, and they got themselves a deer, and they were pulling it out by the tail. And they encountered an old farmer who said, "Now, boys, that deer has handlebars called antlers, so you should be pulling it out by the antlers." They said, "Oh, well, thank you, sir." And they started pulling it by the antlers. And Bill said to Ed, "You know, the old farmer was right. The deer moves much easier when you pull it by the antlers." But the other one said, "Yeah, I know, but the truck keeps getting further away." In other words, they didn't turn the deer around. They just pulled it by the antlers. Okay. Sorry I had to explain it. But anyway, the point of the story is that the deer is the national economy. Pulling by the antlers the wrong way is Senator Sanders and his company. The truck where the deer needs to get is the American people working and waiting for the fruits and of their labor reward investment. So my job as a new senator, should I be favored by the people of Vermont with both the nomination and the election, would be to turn the deer around and load up the truck. Okay, so moving off of the metaphor to explain, loading up the truck means turning away from the collectivist principles of socialism, where the score is basically 39-0 in the countries that have tried it, and returning with great vigor and enthusiasm to the founding principles that have made America throughout time, throughout the last 100 years, for the most part, the envy of all nations, because we have fed more people, housed more people, and nurtured more people as an American nation than any country that has existed before. The reason China is catching up with us, in fact, is that they looked at America in around 1980, and they said, well, our socialist system is collapsing as the Soviet system did a few years after that. How can we emulate the American system without giving up our political power? And they cleverly figured that out. They reverted to free enterprise, although they retained the political tyranny. So that's why economically they're able to compete with us again, and why they still don't have a system that allows their citizens the liberty that's enshrined in our founding documents. And in fact, the liberty that's enshrined in our founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution, is what sets us apart, and as President Reagan said, makes us a shining city on a hill.
So then it was your concern about some of the positions that Senator Sanders has adopted over the years that really kind of motivated you to say, hey, you know, we have to challenge his brand of thinking.
Yeah. Now, I grew up in a politically engaged family. You know, my family talked politics at the dinner table, and the left-wing variety when I was 6, 7, 8 years old. Before I was even in my teens, I was a civil rights activist. So I've been politically engaged and a student and an observer of politics all my life. And I also have been a student of what works and what doesn't work. And even though early in life I was an admirer of the apparent social concern for all people as exemplified and propagandized by socialist doctrine, as I grew older, started to earn a living, started to study business, what works, I found that what really feeds the most people, what really nurtures the most people, what really takes care of the most people is a free enterprise system where people can build their businesses, live their lives freely, hire others. The others can learn business and then open their own businesses or help expand existing businesses. You know, the greatest enterprises in our country once were sort of out of the garage or off the farm type models, which grew by entrepreneurial grit, labor, and investment. So over the years, I began to metamorphosize from my socialist early moorings into understanding that if you don't have control over the fruits of your own labor, then you're not really free, which is why liberty, life, liberty, and property are talked about in the preamble to the Constitution.
And you feel that that ability to be an entrepreneurial person who might start their own business or kind of pursue their own dreams in one way or another, is that's under some kind of threat or assault, or not people aren't able to do that as well as they should be?
Well, if you know, the doctrines of socialism basically say that you exist for the collective good more than you exist for the individual good, conveniently ignoring the fact that when people do exercise the freedom to do the best they can for themselves, the rippling, ramifying effect to everybody around them is only positive. Because if a man or woman starts a business and by their own drive, sweat, perspiration, risk, receives the rewards, the fruits of that effort, then they hire other people. Then they have the money to pay their bills, to invest in other things, their own business, to expand their business. And that sets up a whole sort of economic ecosystem of prosperity, which is part of the cornerstone of the blessings of the United States of America. And that very cornerstone is under attack by the false doctrines of socialism. Now, I know why socialism has become so attractive again in our country, because it expresses this care and concern for the welfare of people. And I think that those who are attracted to socialism because they admire the concern for all people, say with this whole notion of Medicare for all, sure, that sounds wonderful that everybody's health care needs to be taken care of. Now let me say this, all people of goodwill would love to see the best health care provided for the greatest number of people at the lowest possible price. What I would like to assert is that that model of successful healthcare delivery will not be delivered by Medicare for all, $32 trillion over 10 years, which Senator Sanders admits he only has a notion about how to pay for half of it, and the half he thinks he knows how to pay for would be with raising 5 taxes, and it still wouldn't do half the job, but the other half would be paid for by adding $16 trillion to the national debt. And neither is the model which has been in effect prior to now, which has proven less than completely satisfactory, which is crony capitalism type of healthcare delivery, where the bureaucracy, the healthcare providers, and the insurers get together and they sort of set how things are going to work. No, here's what will work, because I don't want to just say what doesn't work, because I do know what will work. What works is throwing open the gates to competition in healthcare, throwing open the gates so that, and lowering the barriers for new health insurance companies to start up, for health insurance companies not to be restricted from crossing state boundaries. How arbitrary is that? From coming, if we had 10 insurance carriers vying for the business of Vermonters, the rates, this is what always happens when you have competition. Prices goes down, quality goes up. This is axiomatic in business, and that's why competition is so wonderful.
But isn't healthcare a sort of a different animal from, let's say, selling cars or refrigerators or something like that? You're talking about a commodity that basically, people can't do without. I mean, if you're either healthy or you're not, and your quality of life is either good or bad, that's something that's kind of harder, I think, to put a dollar value on, is it not? I mean, your health, your well-being, I mean, that's worth everything.
Oh, it's critical.
So, I mean, I think one of the issues that seems to have been is that when you try and treat healthcare as something that's a market commodity, the normal price structure of competition doesn't quite apply as well as when we're talking about other tangible goods.
Well, the answer to the question inherent in your statement is yes and no. Yes, it is the same as other goods and services, and no, it is completely unique, just like every other good and service. And competition, the principle of competition, works for the provision of any service or any goods. Now, I admit we have made the situation much more complicated than it needs to be with the governmental infrastructure, the regulations, and the barriers to opening up insurance companies. We have made it so mind-bogglingly complex that the average person doesn't want to know about it, which is part of the appeal of Medicare for all. Just, you pay for it and I just get healthy and forget about it. Yeah, it's very appealing, but it doesn't work. Here's the first reason it doesn't work. We already have socialized medicine, which is what Medicare for all is. Did you know we already have socialized medicine? It's called the Veterans Administration. The Veterans Administration has the highest budget, second only to the Defense Department in our federal government. Their budget is $180 billion. They have 150 facilities. All of those facilities are owned by the government, and all the people, doctors, nurses, administration that work there are all government employees. What is the scorecard for the Veterans Administration? Now, I don't mean to impugn the hardworking people who go there every day to try to do their best to heal our veterans. But the scorecard on the Veterans Administration is really an F. Ironically, Senator Sanders sat as chair of the Veterans Affairs Committee in 2014 when the Phoenix and other hospitals had the scandal of the false waiting lists that they falsified to make it look like that the 14-day waiting period was really being met when veterans were waiting over a year for service, and many of them were dying while they were waiting. And Senator Sanders' solution, as always, because whenever you spend money that's somebody else's, it's very easy to throw it around. But when you spend the money that you earn, you're much more careful. Senator Sanders decided to throw X number of $1 billion at the problem, thinking that rooting out the corruption and the basic premise of socialized medicine could be healed by sending more money at it. No. In fact, the situation has gotten worse, and the VA is sort of a symbol for failure. Now, if the federal government can't take care of 21 million of the most precious Americans, the ones who've written a blank check up to and including the price of their lives as veterans for the American people and the American nation, they can't take care of those 21 million, how? Oh, tell me, are they going to take care of the health care of 328 million? Not only that, of the 21 million, only 7 million of the veterans even bother to go to the VA for their health care because they kind of know, and it varies from city to city to town, and I hear that we have a wonderful facility here in our state, but they know that they won't necessarily get the care they need when they go there. Yeah.
Another big issue that's roiling the waters today is the whole immigration question. We've been watching as that's been kind of a big subject where there's been a lot of concern about, I guess, quote unquote, illegal immigration into the country. Yeah. What would your feeling be on what we should be doing?
Sure.
If elected? What would be the best case scenario for managing immigration?
Well, first let me say that legal immigration is something that I'm immensely personally grateful for because my grandparents came here, and that's how I got here. Of course, my story is not different from most Americans. We're a nation that has grown through the immigration of people coming in here. And up until recently, there was never even a question where you would have to use the word quote unquote as you did or seemed to do a moment ago when talking about illegal immigration. Because, of course, people have to come into this country legally.
And there are no quotas behind that.
Well, whether they're quotas or what they are is a subset of the basic issue which I would like to address. My grandparents came in legally through Ellis Island. They were inspected, they were evaluated, and they were allowed in. They didn't have any presumption that they were owed the right to come in, nor did they crash the gate. And when they came in, nobody owed them a living. They scrimped down and saved and worked down to their fingernails in order to survive in the Lower East Side of Manhattan. And they never complained that their adopted country wasn't treating them well. Now, we have people that are euphemistically referred to as undocumented workers. Please, if you're an illegal immigrant, you have already broken the law by the time you've crossed the border. I'm sorry. Now, how do we deal with that? First of all, by calling it what it is. We have to control our own borders. A country that doesn't have a border is not a country. A country that doesn't have its own sovereignty is not a country. A country that allows people to freely come and go. Ask any other country in the world if they do that. Ask Mexico to the south how many machine guns are on the border of their wall to the south. No, and yet they want to freely blame us if we don't let anybody just cross the Rio Grande at will. So we have to have, it has to be established, the rule of law has to be established. Now, what do we do with the influx? And isn't there a difference between refugees fleeing for their lives and those who are merely economic migrants? Or those who, like a certain pernicious segment of these immigrants, actually come to do us harm, like drug, slave traffickers, and cartel people? How do we keep those people out if we don't have a border control scenario? So we have to strengthen the border, and we have to have a way to control it. And unfortunately, the people who, wearing the mantle of false compassion for the people coming across, are ignoring our own citizenry. Where's the compassion for the people who live here, who've raised their families here, who've paid taxes all their lives, who pay for the schools and the hospitals? Where's the compassion for these people when people from other countries illegally flood across and burden our services? This has to be modified, it has to be corrected. We have to develop a system and a process, and it's not a one-sentence or one-phrase answer. It has to be studied by people who are dedicated to solving this problem, recognizing the sovereignty and authority of America, and solving the problem of how to deal with this influx. But just the fact that it's being addressed will slow the influx, because people will know they can't just come pouring across anymore.
Would you favor what President Trump has proposed and build a wall costing $20 billion? Is that part of the solution?
I believe it could be part of the solution. I understand, just as the Israelis have found out, that walls can be tunneled under. I believe that they're in the 21st century, and this is something, before we run out of time, I do want to talk about digital opportunity, and I hope we have a moment, because we've been talking about some tough subjects, and that sound like bad news, but I have some great news that I want to share.
All right.
But, but there are digital solutions also that can be available to help with the control at the border. And if I'm elected senator, I will be talking to the people much smarter than me about those things, about how to deploy those and maybe mix and match with other controls at the border. I have just begun to study this issue in the last few months. If I'm nominated and elected, I will become an amateur expert, if I may say that, as a senator. But here's the good news. The good news is that Vermont is about to undergo a tremendous renaissance, an economic renaissance. Why do I say this? Is it because I'm just a happy-go-lucky, optimistic sort of fellow? Well, that's not generally exactly how most people characterize me, but it's because I know that starting within 6 months, satellite broadband connectivity over the country is becoming a reality, with SpaceX and NASA all competing to deliver this service in low-orbit satellites. So I ask our viewers and you to consider, what will Vermont be like when internet and broadband service with 100 times wider pipeline coming down to us than the best we can get right now from our local providers is ubiquitously available all over the state? Think about it. Vermont is already a beautiful magnet because of its aesthetic beauty and because of its mountains, its hills, its dales, its glens, rushing rivers. People come here, being here is a vacation for you when you take a moment, even if you live here, if you take a moment to stop your activities and just look around, as I do when I come out of my house, because I come from the Bronx. When I came out of my house, I looked at concrete and streets. Now I come out of my house and I look at Green Peak, I look at Mother Merrick, I look at the Green Mountains and this. So being here psychologically, mentally can be a vacation. But I'm telling us all what we already know. So when you add to that the ability in every little village and hamlet throughout the Northeast Kingdom, Bennington County, you name it, anywhere in the state, for small startup-preneurs with great new digital ideas who want to come and start businesses, who are no longer restricted, but have the same or greater capability than Austin, Silicon Valley, New York, and LA have now to start their businesses, even with 3, 4, 5, 8, if you will, low carbon footprint businesses. And they are successful and they're making money. What is one successful business? How does it ramify and ripple out to the benefit of the entire surrounding community? Because all those employees have money to spend. They need to go to restaurants. They need to buy food. They need to go to the drugstore. They need all the goods and services we all need. So the whole economic ecosystem starts to grow and prosper in each of our little towns. And why would not the people with the greatest ideas want to come to the most beautiful place, or arguably the most beautiful place in the country? They will. And our graduates, our recent graduates who are feeling the need to exodus to other places where there's greater commercial activity, they no longer will have to do that because they can grow right where they were planted. And this will be a great new experience for Vermont. So you might say reasonably, okay, well, thanks for giving us the good news. What do you have to do with that as being a senator? Well, since senators and government never deliver goods and services, only the private sector does, thank God for that, the first job of government is to stay out of the way of success and not create any legislation that would complicate the matter and obstruct the freedom of utility of this great expansion of capability. Secondly, to look for ways, if any exist, to lubricate the wheels of progress, such as may arise as this thing unfolds. And going back to the healthcare discussion, another important factor, the FDA needs to be reformed. The FDA purports to perform a valuable service, and in many cases it does, by approving new inventions and new pharmaceutical goods so that the American people are not harmed by new drugs and new inventions. Fine. But why should you need $100 million, which basically limits competition to only the handful of mega pharmaceutical companies to even go through the process, when some of the smallest ingenious companies have the best new ideas? So we need to find a way for FDA to fast track in the age where the genome, which used to cost $2.7 billion and took 15 years, soon you can genome, which is a map of the DNA of your whole human body, for less than it costs to take a shower. In an age like this of biomedical breakthroughs right on the horizon, we need to stop letting the FDA act like they acted in 1950. We need to throw open the doors in a way that protects the American public, but allows for a streamlined approval process.
We have a few minutes left, and I guess just to kind of close things down, I just was just thinking, if there was one, you mentioned we've talked about a couple of industries along the way here that you feel like should undergo some changes. But I guess I was just wondering, is there one industry you feel in particular needs more deregulation than they currently are having to deal with? You mentioned the government sometimes gets in the way of the private sector, in your opinion, for being more creative and more job producing and wealth generating. Is there one particular piece of governmental regulation that's currently in place that you would, if elected, really would like to see either removed or modified in some way to sort of free up the private sector?
Well, there's probably at least a half a dozen that I don't know about connected with the healthcare regulation morass that the government inflicts on healthcare delivery right now. In general, every regulation that is in place that prevents or limits the ability of doctors and insurers to deliver the goods and services needs to be restudied and examined for whether it should still be in place. The problem with government and regulations is once they're in place, even if they may have been partially or wholly appropriate 20 years ago, that doesn't mean that they match the 21st century reality. So we need a complete overhaul of our healthcare delivery system. And this is a critical dimension for America, and it's being brought to light by the whole notion of Medicare for all, which essentially means Medicare for none, since nobody is going to be able to deliver a $32 trillion colossus, where Senator Sanders thinks that the $16 trillion, which is only half of that he could raise by raising 5 taxes, and just letting $16 trillion get added to the already $21 trillion debt, which is the biggest danger facing America right now, is not Russia or China, but it's our exploding deficit, which, because we're having economic good times, nobody's talking about. But I can promise you, if I'm elected senator, I'll be talking about the deficit a lot.
Well, that's an interesting point. I mean, one of the byproducts, it seems to me, of the tax package that was enacted last year by Congress, which reduced the corporate tax rate and other taxes, is that it is fueling that deficit. In the long run, that's a time bomb that's about to go off in a relatively short period. 5 to 10 years from now, the tax money that's not being collected, that would have been collected under the older rules, is just going to go to fuel that deficit. It's always amazed me that more people haven't been more concerned about that.
Well, I only half agree with you. And here's the half I agree with you. Yes, from a static revenue analysis, when you lower taxes, the taxes you would have got if the taxes stayed higher are not there anymore, so the deficit goes up. That's a static analysis. On the other hand, when you lower taxes on productivity, you have more productivity, more goods and services to tax, so that the rising tide raises the ships. But that's, I would hasten to add, not the full solution. The other half of the solution is we have to take a big diet when it comes to spending. We have been expanding our spending. Under the Obama administration, in those 8 years, the deficit actually tripled from around 8 trillion to 16 trillion. Sad to say that since President Trump has taken over, the deficit has not gone down, but it's a little more palatable because we have economic good times. But it's a sneaking, hulking problem in our background. Let me just make it real on the human scale. If you or I ran our household and our deficit was an additional, say we earned, for the sake of discussion, $50,000 a year, but we spent $75,000 a year and we're going more into debt, $25,000 more a year, how many years could we last before our creditors just shut us down, took our house and threw us out in the street? Not many. The reason the government has been able to do the same thing that we can't do as individuals is because they have a monopoly on the printing press, and they can just vote to expand the deficit as if there are no future consequences. But as certain alert congressmen in past years have pointed out, there are consequences for spending beyond your means. Before that bill comes due, we need to turn around from our profligate spending and reduce the amount of spending and reevaluate every single department that we spend money on.
Including the Defense Department.
Including the Defense Department. Okay. Although I will be quick to add that the defense of the United States of America is the single most legitimate function of the federal government. And having said that, I still agree that there's huge amounts of waste and crony capitalism built into that system that needs to be ruthlessly dealt with in a way that benefits the American taxpayer and still protects the American citizen.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately. Boy, there's a lot more we could talk about, I think, if we had more time. But thank you, Lawrence, for being with us today and sharing your views with us. Always interesting to have these conversations. And thank you all as well for watching us today. This has been GNAT TV's In-Depth series, another edition of that. Glad to have had you with us today. Hope you've enjoyed the show, and we'll see you again the next time.